Okay, in the last few videos, we discussed the Splunk web user interface. So we basically saw an overview of the interface. We went ahead to talk about Splunk apps, and then we also saw two apps that come by default with your installation of Splunk. That is the home app, and then the search and reporting app. We discussed users and roles. So Splunk web user interface is just one of the ways that you can use and administer Splunk. So in this video, we're going to see two other ways that you can use and administer Splunk. That is Splunk Command Line Interface or Splunk CLI and configuration files. Now, before we move forward, we have some information for you here. You can now gain free access to the Splunk Essentials course on Udemy. This course actually provides a complete foundational knowledge that is required to start your Splunk journey. So what you're going to notice is that it's going to be a combination of the videos that we have here and a lot more information. And as well, it provides you with a platform to easily grow your experience. And subsequently, it's going to prepare you, for you to take Splunk certification. So the link is in the description below. And after that, what else do you want to do? If you want to keep growing in Splunk, an idea is going to be for you to start taking Splunk certification. So do you want to pass your very first Splunk certification? If the answer is yes, we've also included a link to the Splunk Core Certified User course on Udemy. This course covers a complete course material and sample exam questions that are required for you to pass the Splunk Core Certified User exam. So you can also check the link in the description. If you want more information about upcoming Splunk certifications, visit our website as well at ralkimsolutions.com. And finally, please make sure you like, subscribe, turn on the notification bell for new videos. Okay, let's officially just look at the three different ways that you can use and administer Splunk. The first one here is the Splunk web user interface, which we've already seen before. So this just provides you a web user interface through which you can use and administer Splunk. And this is going to be used by people with the user and power role almost 100% of the time. Let's suppose that you get hired by an organization somewhere, you get access to Splunk and you're being given, for example, the power role because like, okay, maybe you know some Splunk, you get the power role in there. Then most of your access is going to be through the web user interface. So you're going to be working on the web user interface almost 100% of the time. And I think that when you do that a lot, sometimes you kind of think, is there any other way that I can use and administer Splunk? Yes, of course, there are other ways, but people with the user and power roles, their access is mostly through the web user interface. But that does not mean that you cannot perform administration tasks on the web user interface. Think about it. When we were discussing the web UI, we saw that under the settings menu, there were a lot of different sub menus there. The knowledge menu was basically the one that people with the user role and power roles will see, right? But with the admin, you're going to see a lot of different sub menu items there. So you can do administration tasks, you can create new users, you can update users, you can configure authentication, you can configure the deployment server, you can configure indexing of data from different sources and all that kind of thing. That those capabilities are not going to be available for people with the user and power roles. Now, the second one is the Splunk Command Line Interface. Remember, when we install Splunk, being it on Windows, on Linux, on Mac OS, there was a part where we say we want to start Splunk. So we're going to navigate into the installation directory, which for Windows was program files, Splunk, and then we go into the bin folder and we set that the Splunk binary lives there. For Linux, it was the same. It was opt/splunk/bin. We said the Splunk binary lives there. And then for Mac OS, I think it was applications/splunk/bin. That Splunk binary that lives there is what we call the Splunk Command Line Interface. So basically, you can pass commands on the CLI to this binary and then it's going to perform actions within Splunk. Most of the things that you can do on Splunk web user interface, you can also do these things using the Splunk Command Line Interface. So you can configure new users, as we just said, make configuration changes there, run searches. You can actually run searches on the CLI, just the same way that you're going to use your Splunk search processing language, which we're going to see. In order to run searches on the Splunk web UI, you can do that on the CLI as well, and it's going to get results for you. So there is information on Splunk documentation that has command syntax that you have to use in order to do things on the Splunk command line interface. But one thing that you have to know is that the CLI is typically reserved for admin users. So when you just have the user and power role, most of the time you're not going to be using Splunk command line interface. Now, the third one is configuration files. So the third way you can use and administer Splunk is just by using configuration files in the back end. And then this is also again reserved for admin users, because most of the time people with the user and power roles don't have access to these configuration files in the back end in order to make changes. Now, almost every aspect of Splunk is determined by configuration settings. What does this really mean? So these changes that we just spoke about, that you can do on the web user interface or you do on the Splunk command line interface, ultimately it updates configuration files in the backend. So if I go into the web user interface and I create a safe search or an alert or a dashboard, there's going to be a configuration file in the backend that is being updated with that information that I used, it being it on the web or on the command line interface. But does that mean that I only have to go and make those changes on the Splunk web or on the Splunk command line interface in order to update those configuration files? No, I can actually go into the backend and directly update these configuration files. So I can create a search by a safe search or a report by just updating a configuration file, or create an alert by just updating a configuration file. So it's exactly the same thing that you can do using Splunk Web and Splunk CLI. Okay, so let's now just officially define the Splunk command line interface. So the Splunk command line interface or Splunk CLI is that binary that we just spoke about, that it can help you to run searches, monitor, configure, perform other admin tasks using the Splunk command line interface. So really you are not on the web UI. Things that you can do on the web UI, you can just do it in the CLI. So in this specific case, we are looking at Linux. So if you are looking at Linux here, you're going to see, like, let me use the laser pointer here. This is your installation directory opt/splunk, and then you can actually change and go into the bin folder here, and that is where your Splunk binary actually lives. And then installation directory is referred to as Splunk home. This is what you're going to see a lot in the documentation as you continue learning Splunk. Anytime that Splunk home is mentioned, then know that that is the directory in which Splunk has been installed, which on Windows, we're going to reiterate again, is c/program file/Splunk. And if you wanted to access the Splunk binary, you have to go into the bin folder. On Linux, it's opt Splunk bin, and on Mac OS is applications Splunk bin. Now, how do you then check your installation directory using the Splunk Web UI? Let's suppose that you were working in the Splunk Web UI and then you felt like there was something that you really needed to do with the Splunk CLI. Maybe you wanted to start and restart Splunk, maybe you wanted to use the Splunk CLI, or some task was just, you were just more comfortable doing it on the CLI. And then you were thinking, what is my installation directory? Remember, these directories that we are talking about here for Windows, Linux, and Mac OS, these are default directories. It doesn't always mean that you have to install Splunk in those directories. Sometimes in the installation process, maybe you are not the one that installed the instance and then you are just working on it. You don't know which directory Splunk is installed in. How do you check that on the Splunk web? So you can actually go to settings, server settings, and then general settings. So in this case, this is an instance that is installed on Linux. So as you can see here, it's showing you that the installation path is opt/Splunk. So this one was actually installed in the default directory for Linux. And so you can then run admin commands using that Splunk binary file. Okay, so let's now see how you can run some commands from the Splunk command line interface. One of the first things to note here is that in order to execute commands from the CLI, you have to be in the installation directory. So you have to go into that installation directory, then navigate into your bin folder where the Splunk binary lives. Once you are there, then you can execute those commands. Again, here we are looking at the case of Linux. For example, here you want to check the status of Splunk, you can use Splunk status. And here, for example, it's going to show you, as you see here, that Splunk is running. The second example that we're going to use here is to check the version of Splunk. So if you wanted to check the version of Splunk, then you can always do Splunk version, and it's going to show you like this is version 9.0.4.1. Another example here is that you can enable boot start. Remember, we saw this before, that with Linux, after installation, you have to enable boot start to make sure that the next time that your instance restarts, then Splunk is automatically going to start. So this is the command. We've seen this before. You just have to go there, Splunk enable boot start, and then you can also start and restart Splunk on the command line interface. So as a matter of fact, as we said before, there are so many commands that you can execute, things that you can do on the web UI, you can do them from the command line interface. And the syntax you use for things like running searches, creating users and administration tags and all that stuff is also found on Splunk documentation online. Okay, now let's discuss configuration files. In the previous slide, we just said that the Splunk binary is located in the bin folder of your installation directory. Now, if you wanted to access configuration files, these files are located in the etc folder of your installation directory, which means that if you are in Windows, you're going to have the default, which is program files Splunk, and then you go into the etc folder. That's where you locate your configuration files. In Linux, it's going to be opt Splunk etc, and in Mac OS, it's going to be application/Splunk/etc. And another thing to note with configuration files is that they're always going to have a .conf extension. Let's now try to break this down just to get more understanding. Let's suppose that we are having a Linux installation. So we have our package, we've done our Splunk installation, our Splunk home, which is the default in this case, is going to be opt/Splunk. That's really our Splunk home for Linux. Now, if you want to break this in the hierarchy in just how the files are available in this installation directory, if you go into the bin folder there, that is where you're going to locate your Splunk CLI. That is where Splunk CLI lives, as we've already seen in the previous slide. The next one here now is the one that we are discussing. So if you want to see where your configuration files live within your Splunk installation directory, is in the etc folder of your installation directory. Now you also have other directories there. You have like the lib, which is for Splunk related libraries. So libraries that are being used by binaries. And then of course you have your var. Most of the time, the var directory is where you have variable files. So files that are growing. When you have logs, logs are always going to be growing. Maybe there are errors, you're going to have more logs and stuff like that. And then of course index buckets as well are in the var folder. The reason being because they grow, because as you index data into Splunk, this index buckets, which are the files within a very, very specific hierarchy that we saw before, they continue growing. That's why you have these index buckets in the var folder. And of course, there are other folders that are available as well. But this was just to give you a high-level picture of the folders that are available within the Splunk installation directory. Okay, so now what we're going to do here is that we're going to go into that folder, the etc folder that contains your configuration files, and again try to break it down into lower level folders, so for you just to understand the structure of how the files are organized within this folder. So the first one that we're going to see here is etc/system. So when you go into etc/system, this is where system-wide configuration files are placed. So these are files that are applicable to all applications. Remember, we said that when you have your instance of Splunk, you can install different apps. So let's suppose that there are also other apps that come by default, and then you can go to Splunk base and stuff like that. You can create your own apps. All those apps are going to be part of your instance. But if you have any configurations that are going to be the same across all those apps, then those configurations are going to be under the system folder. The second one here is the app folder. So now there are configuration files that are specific for different apps. We said, for example, that the search and reporting app is the default app that you use to perform searches when you have some data index in Splunk from day one. So if you go into the etc folder, there is an apps folder there. And under the apps folder, there's going to be a folder name that's associated with the search and reporting app, just like any other app that you have installed on your Splunk instance. So for example, you have the event gen app is going to be here. You have maybe your SIEM app, it's going to be here as well. The common information model is going to be here as well. And so when you go into each of those folders, you're going to see configuration files that are specific for those different apps that you have installed on your instance. Now, the third one here is the user folder. So this one is for private user private configuration for the current app. So for example, you are working within the search and reporting app. And let's say that you only have a user role. Remember we said with the user role, you can only create private objects. You cannot share them. So anything that is associated to a specific user is going to be found in this user folder. So basically, it's going to go etc users. And let's say that your username was jcloud or mfrost as we saw before. There's going to be a folder that has that name, and then when you go inside it, it's going to be the name of the current app that you're using. It could be the search app, and then if you go under that, it's going to see the configuration files that are private for that specific user. And now those folders again have a further breakdown. So when you go into the system folders or the app folders or the user folders, there is a default folder there. And this default folder is where you have your initial configuration files. What does this mean? When you install Splunk, Splunk comes out of the box with some default configuration. So this default configuration, no one has changed anything within your instance yet. Those configuration files are going to be located under the default folder. Now, you have another folder that is called the local folder. This one, it can come or it may not even be there. So if you wanted to make changes on top of the default configuration that came with your installation of Splunk, those changes have to be in the local folder. So if maybe there was a file within the default folder that you had to update, you have to copy that. If the local folder never even existed, you have to create it, copy that file into the local folder and update it there. And there is a reason for this. You don't have to update the files in the default folder directly. Because if you update those, the next time that there is an upgrade or an update in Splunk or whatever, those files are going to be overwritten. So it is recommended that any changes that you're making on top of the configuration that came out of the box, you have to make those changes in the local folder. And then, of course, there are other folders as well, but the most important ones is to understand the default and then the local folders that you have within these different three directory structures. Now, what are some examples? There are some configuration files that can be handled in the context of system. So, for example, we just said that system level configurations are going to be files that are common across all applications. So if you are to create indexes, that's an activity that happens in the global context. It's not specific to an app. Inputs.conf, you have source types.conf and web.conf, for example. All these are configuration files that are associated with the system as a whole. Now, for the users and the app context, you have configuration files for them as well. So safesearches.conf, for example, is going to contain your reports. So if I'm going in there and I wanted to create a report, I could say, oh, my report is only going to be on the search app. Or maybe there's an app that was created for my department. I want that report to be within that app. So these are configuration files that are in the context of an app or maybe in some user's context. So the user is maybe in the search app, but creates a safe search and say that safe search is only going to be available to me. I don't want to share it at the app level. So these two contexts, which are the app and the user context, these are example configuration files that you can see there. You have safe searches where you can have your reports. You have like eventtypes.conf, you have tags.conf and userpreferences.conf. So that's basically just a high level of how these configuration files are organized within the etc folder of your installation directory. Here you see I'm showing an instance here. It's actually a Linux virtual machine that I installed for, was Azure virtual machine that I initiated. And then I installed my Splunk on that, right? So here I'm actually just connected to it via, again, the mobile extern SSH client. And then we're going to try to look at Splunk CLI here. And of course, after that, we're going to go as well on this web interface, right? Here I have two instances of Splunk. The first one is the one that I installed locally that we actually worked with when we were looking at the Splunk web UI. And then this other one is the one that is related to the Linux instance that you see here, right? So this is a Linux virtual machine on which Splunk is installed. And this is the corresponding web UI here. So as you can see, because it's a remote instance, I'm not using localhost, right? I'm actually using the public IP address, followed by the port number. Okay, so let's go back here. The first things first, what we saw here is that for you to be able to initiate Splunk CLI commands, you need to be in your home directory, which is the up Splunk, and then you have to navigate to bin, right? So once you're here, then now you are in the bin directory, and this is where your Splunk CLI lives. So I'm not going to take too much time here because we've kind of seen these commands, some of these before when we were doing the Splunk installation. So you can come here and do things like, remember I said that since we are not logged in as root user, right, we probably need to escalate our privileges most of the time to root level before we are able to run this command. So I'm going to do sudo, then I'm going to do like Splunk status, right, just to check the status. We know it's running. Right, so you see that Splunk is actually running, and that's why we are connected to the Splunk web UI, and everything looks perfect. I can run another command like maybe just sudo Splunk show say web port. Remember we kept saying that that port is 8000, right? So if we run this, it's gonna ask me for my Splunk credentials here. Okay, let me just put it. Hope my password is correct. Yeah, so you see the web port is here, right? That's port 8000 that we've been talking about, right? And then I can also do something like, sudo then Splunk, Splunk version, for example. I want to see the version of Splunk. So this is the version of Splunk that we are working with, which is 9.1.02. Remember the one that we were actually seeing in the demonstrations was like 9.0, I think. So this is a much higher version because this one was just recently installed, right? So quite a few things that you can do here. I can do, for example, Splunk list licenses, right? So I want to see the licenses on this instance. So when I do that, you're going to see the list here actually. So you can see a license group actually here for the trial license, right? And you want to get those information, you can look at the details in here. So those are some of the things that you can do. So just the same way you're starting these commands with Splunk something, there is syntax online in the Splunk documentation that can tell you to do a whole lot of things, right? We already saw when we install Splunk that you can start Splunk from here, you can restart Splunk, you can configure boot start so that Splunk starts automatically if you restart your instance. You can change configurations, right? In the configuration files, either you update them themselves or you also have syntax that you can run here to update configurations. You can run searches. So basically, most of the things that you do on Splunk Web, right, you can also do those kind of things on Splunk CLI. Okay, so what we're going to do right now is that we're going to go back to, let's go to the web interface that we saw here. And remember that when we connected here before, one of the things that we did at the time that we did this Splunk web UI is that we created two reports. One of those reports was for the power user and one of the reports was for the basic user, right? Let's just start here by trying to access those reports. So I can go here. There are things I can do. I can go to the search and reporting app, right? I can access reports from here, right? If I access reports from here, this one shows me reports that are shared within the search and reporting app. So when I look at it here, I see the power users report, but I don't see the basic users report, right? Because that report was never shared. But if I want to see everything, I can go here. Remember, we did say that the administrator sees everything, right? So search reporting app, administrator doesn't own any reports here. So let's take all. And then when you look at this, you can see this is the power users report here. Let me just do something here like essentials. Yep, so it gives me those two reports, right? This is my power users report, and then this is the basic users report here. So we can run those reports again just to verify what they look like. If you run the power users report, then you see that it's a little bit partial because on this instance now, I think I just started it. It stopped indexing at some time when my computer shut down. So this is really not a problem. Okay. So and then I can also run the basic users report just to see what's there, right? So that's it. The same kind of thing. All right. So those reports are actually there. So what we are going to do now is to access our Windows instance. Remember we said that this instance here is installed on Windows, and then see if we can go to the back end and then check the configuration files and locate these reports inside, right? So we're going to start with the power users report. Now you see that the power users report is at app level. So you expect it to be in the app folder, right? Remember we said we had the system, we had the app, and then we have the user. So let's just go here to Windows. Sorry, I'm going to go here. And then this is my C, right? So remember we said that Splunk on Windows is installed in C program files. So if I go into program files, the expectation is that I'm going to see Splunk, right? So I can go to Splunk here. And then when I go to Splunk, remember we said we had the bin, we had the etc, we had the lib, we had the share, we had the var, and then we said we had other folders in here, right? But the configuration files are located in the etc folder. So if I go into etc, and then I'm going to see the users private objects are going to be in the users folder, and then apps are going to be in the apps folder, right? So if I go into apps here, and then which app am I currently working on now? I'm on the search and reporting app. It's sometimes also referred to just as the search app, right? When you go into the back end, it's just called the search app. So this is it here. If I go into the search app, and then we're going to see those folders we spoke about, the default folder and then the local folder, right? The default folder, we said this comes by default in the configuration when you install Splunk. So you don't really have to touch anything in here, right? If you updated anything like the report that we created, is going to be saved in the local folder, because that's not something that came with your installation. That's something that you configured later on. So, and we also said that reports are stored in savesearches.com. So let's try and open this up to see if we can find that report there. All right, I'm just going to open it with Notepad. This one's it's taking some time here. Bear with me. Okay, so here we go. All right, so you can see here that there are two reports. This is one that I had created at some other time, right? But this is our report right here. So you see the report name is given here as a stanza. So one of the things that you're going to notice with configuration files is that they always have the stanza name followed by, the settings that you're looking for. So you can see here, this is that search that we defined, right? We have the index data, and then we have all this information about the search. So if you look at it here, it's also saying that it's a line chart. It's that kind of visualization. You also see the time interval, the earliest and latest time. Can you come to the back end and just define this way? And then maybe under some conditions, you might have to restart your instance, and then it shows up on the web UI. Yes, you can do that. So we said that you can also update configuration files directly. So that's the relationship there. You see that we can actually see a configuration file, something that we've done in Splunk Web, and then we go and locate it within configuration files in the backend if we actually understand how it works. Now, that's how you do it on Windows. Now, talking about Linux, this is our Linux instance now here, right, which corresponds to what we have here in CLI. So let me just clear this one to go back up. And then in our Linux instance, I replicated those same reports that we created. Okay, we did in the Windows instance, but I created the same reports in the Linux instance just so that we'll be able to see. So we're going to go here again. We're going to look at the power users report. Okay, so we go here, and then we want to see all the reports, and then I'm just going to type again essentials here, just like we did in the Windows instance. So sorry, I just typed that wrong. And then you see both reports, right? This is again my power users report, but this is now in my Linux instance. And we said that it's again shared at app level. So I'm going to go here to Linux, and I'm just going to go CD. I'm going to go back one step. And now I'm back in Splunk Home, right? If I list what's here, you see that there is an etc folder. And this is where you have your configuration file. So I can go to etc, list what's there. And then you see the apps folder, right? And because this report is at app level again, as we saw, we can go into apps, and then if I list that, you see all the apps that you have in here, right? You have all the apps, not only those that are visible, of course. We saw this already when we were looking at Splunk Web. So we see the search app there. So we can go to the search app. So now it's the same thing that we did, just that we are navigating it now on Linux, right? So we can go now to the local folder, the same thing, and then you see that's your savesearches.conf here. So let's now see if we can locate that reporting. We're just gonna do a cat command and on this file here, I'm hoping that it's not too much stuff. So let's just, oops, sorry, it's denied. Okay, so maybe I have to use sudo then. Okay, so if I use that, you see that we have our report in there, right? That's again the stanza name. So exactly the same thing that we saw on Windows. That's how you can navigate to it in Linux, right? You see, it shows you exactly the same report. So that's how you can view your report. Now let's look at the private object for the user. Now, when we created the users report, the basic users report in Windows, it's private because we said the basic user doesn't even have the capabilities to share that report so that other people that are logging into the instance and using this app are able to see it, right? So it's going to be in the users folder. Now, if you go into the backend on Windows again, what we're going to do, let's go back to Etsy because that's where we have configuration files. Now, instead of apps, we saw that those private objects are going to be in the users folder. So if I go to users and then it's the basic user that created it, so I'm going to go into the basic users folder, and in there now, because it was in the context of the search app is right there. And then I go to the local folder and then I see savesearches.conf, right? If I open that, I'm going to take just once because I'll probably change it. Okay, so there we go, right? That's it. Okay, so let's go try to see the same thing on Linux. So if we go back here again and go right here, you see the basic users report on Linux is right here. So if we go back, then we have to go back to, I'm just going to do up Splunk. Okay, it's going to take me back here and then I go back to my Etsy, right? So now we are back in the folder that has configuration files. And then now instead of going to apps, because this is private, I'm going to go to users. And then I'm going to go to basic user. Then I'm going to go to search app as we saw. And then if I list that, I'm going to see the local folder there. Like go to local. And then now I see myself savesearches.conf, right? So I'm just going to sudo paste that, cut it. Oh, okay. So that's it there, right? You see that it's the same thing. This is your stanza here. That's the configuration file. That's the stanza in there. Again, you see the definition of your report right here, right? For the basic user. So that's just bottom line how you can do some basic things, right? You can run Splunk CLI commands to do stuff. You can go into these configuration files and change them directly. But another idea I just wanted to point out is what you do on the Splunk web UI. You can also go back to the configuration files and then you see your configurations there.